Acute transplant rejection is a type of transplant rejection that occurs within weeks of receiving a new graft. During acute rejection, T cells react to donor MHCs. There are a few facts you need to remember about acute transplant rejections, so I'll share my visual mnemonic to help you remember all the information for test day. Let's set the scene. A middle-aged man is getting evicted from his apartment. His letter for an extended lease has been rejected. The rejection letter reminds me of transplant rejection. Since both refer to a type of rejection. What about the age of our evicted guy? Well, getting evicted is a middle-aged problem, right? This middle-aged man is our symbol for acute rejection because the onset of acute rejection is in the middle. In other words, acute rejection happens after hyperacute rejection, but before chronic rejection. So no young guns or seniors here, but rather middle-aged people. Putting this together, this middle-aged guy getting rejected should remind you of acute transplant rejection. Acute in medical terms refers to a disease course that happens quickly. So acute transplant rejection is immune rejection of a donor graft organ that occurs quickly, usually within a few weeks after transplant. We'll talk about this course and why this happens in our next few symbols. Next, do you see that 2 weeks notice sign? It's pretty common to give people just a few weeks notice before kicking them out, right? By the way, this 2 weeks notice coincidentally helps me remember that acute rejection occurs within weeks of receiving the transplant. Usually, acute transplant rejection happens 1 to 4 weeks after. How fast organ rejection happens is usually the easiest clue to know what type of rejection you're dealing with. So memorizing that acute rejections happen within weeks is high yield. So we know that acute rejection happens within weeks. But what exactly causes our body to reject the transplant? Turn to the tomahawk on the table. When this guy got the rejection letter, he was so angry that he hit the table with his tomahawk. Yeah, he probably has anger issues. Maybe that's why he's getting evicted. Anyways, this tomahawk is a recurring symbol for T cells since tomahawk starts with the letter T and is used for direct, close-range combat, similar to how T cells function using direct contact. Now, we only are talking about T cells here because T cells are the causative agent in acute transplant rejection. Specifically, host T cells become sensitized against donor MHCs on the transplanted organ. Recall that MHCs are cell surface complexes important for antigen presentation that also serve as a self-identification marker since everyone has a different version of them, kind of like fingerprints. So when the donor's organ expressing donor MHC is put into the new host, the host T cells see this new MHC as foreign. As a result, the host T cells activate an immune response against the graft. This immune response induces direct killing by cytotoxic T cells as well as inflammation stimulated by helper T cells. When this process damages the donated organ, we call it acute transplant rejection. Because acute rejection is an immune response that is undesirable, it's technically a cell-mediated hypersensitivity, formerly called type 4 hypersensitivity. So acute transplant rejections are a type of type 4 hypersensitivity. Now, look at how this tomahawk is wedged into the table. The tomahawk is literally infiltrating the table, which reminds me of T cell infiltration in acute transplant rejection. On biopsy of the donor graft, we observe lymphocytes, especially T cells, infiltrating the blood vessels of the graft. Get it? Because tomahawks represent T cells, and T cells are a type of lymphocyte. So this infiltrating tomahawk represents how T lymphocytes infiltrate the graft. This interstitial lymphocytic infiltrate is high yield, as it can be used to confirm a diagnosis of acute transplant rejection. Okay, so our body's T cells reject the transplant. What do we do to treat acute rejection when it happens? Well, take a look at the man's spouse giving him a cane to help him get up. Giving a cane to help is our symbol for treating with immunosuppression. Since a cane is a recurring symbol of immunosuppression. Since acute transplant rejection is an inappropriate T cell immune response, we can stop or reverse the damage by immunosuppressive drugs, like calcineurin or systemic corticosteroids. We have dedicated scenes for the immunosuppressants, but just remember that immunosuppressive agents can be used to treat acute transplant rejection. Alright, that's it for acute transplant rejections. Let's wish the man luck and recap quickly. Acute transplant rejection happens within weeks of receiving a new donor graft. It's caused by T cells attacking the donor graft after becoming sensitized to donor MHCs. On biopsy of the donor organ, dense interstitial lymphocytic infiltrates are seen under light microscopy. Although serious, acute transplant rejection can be treated or prevented with immunosuppressive drugs. Alright, now we're actually done with acute transplant rejection. I'll catch you on the other side.